Armageddon, a word you do not normally hear from a U.S. president. I'm John Berman with Brianna Keeler. Overnight, President Biden warned that the world could face Armageddon if Vladimir Putin uses nuclear weapons as Russia faces setbacks in Ukraine. This happened at a Democratic fundraiser. The president said, quote, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon."
This is stark language, and it comes as the U.S. considers how to respond to a range of potential scenarios. For more, let's bring in White House correspondent Jeremy Diamond with the very latest on this. Jeremy?
Good morning, Brianna. U.S. officials say that there has been no change in Russia's nuclear posture. In fact, one senior U.S. official telling CNN that the U.S. didn't detect anything yesterday that would indicate an escalation in Russia's nuclear posture. And that's why it's so striking to hear the language that President Biden used last night in talking about the prospect of Armageddon should Putin use nuclear weapons, and making clear that he doesn't believe that the Russian leader is bluffing. Here is a snippet of some of the president's comments from this fundraiser last night in New York, which was off camera. He said, quote, "We've got a guy I know fairly well. He's not joking when he talks about potential use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons, because his military is, you might say, significantly underperforming." And that is one of the things that the president expressed the most concern about last night, is what if Putin doesn't have an off-ramp? What if he is cornered? What does he do then? There's no question that Vladimir Putin has been ratcheting up his rhetoric about the prospect of nuclear war in recent weeks. Just last week, he talked about defending Russian territory by all means necessary, just as he was talking about what he believes is a precedent that the U.S. set in using nuclear weapons back during World War II. But the bottom line, in talking to U.S. officials, it's very clear they believe that there is an elevated risk that Russia could use a nuclear weapon, but they say that ultimately it's not even probable at this point, and they also haven't assessed that Putin's made a decision to use a nuclear weapon. John, Brianna?
Yeah, very important. Jeremy Diamond, thank you.
All right, I want to bring in CNN political and national security analyst and New York Times White House and national security correspondent David Sanger. Armageddon, David, how unusual is this type of language from a U.S. president in 2022, and why now?
Well, John, as you and Jeremy both pointed out, it's highly unusual. I can't recall a time that a president has used it other than in a historical sense, and that's not what President Biden was doing. He was basically warning that one should not take solace in the thought that if Putin uses a nuclear weapon, it would be a tactical or battlefield weapon. That is a smaller one that can be used on the battlefield, and that presumably would have somewhat limited damage. He was basically saying, if he uses it, this will escalate. I think the second really interesting thing that he did was talk about off-ramps and the need for that in the same paragraph that he talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because, of course, that's what Kennedy was seeking during the Cuban Missile Crisis in his dealings with Khrushchev.
Yeah, and what he said, and often President Biden does this, he sort of opens the door to discussions that often happen behind closed doors and lets us in. He said, basically, he's not sure what the off-ramp is from Vladimir Putin.
That's exactly right, and that's what I read out of this as well. Look, this has been a huge subject within the U.S. government. I think most Americans who've been watching Ukraine and watching this horror play out have not been as focused as the president's advisors have been on the possibility of the use of a nuclear weapon. Now, I don't think that possibility is a very high chance yet, but it's a lot higher than it was at the beginning of the war. And that's what has so many of his advisors concerned. The president alluded to this himself, John, when he said that Putin is not performing well on the battlefield. In other words, he's saying he may have no other option to save face, and that's why he was looking for the off-ramps. Now, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the way Kennedy did this was a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey, which happened 6 months after the crisis was over, and of course was all denied at the time by the government. It was part of the deal. The issue is, what's the analog here? What could you offer Putin, and if you did, would he take it?
Yeah, it's very difficult to imagine something like that, specifically something that doesn't involve Ukrainian territory, which of course would be completely unpalatable to the Ukrainians. David Sanger, great to see you. Thank you so much.